Ever get that feeling? You wake up, everything seems normal, but something feels off, like the world's holding its breath.
Yeah, it's that contrast, isn't it? The way life just keeps ticking along, even with these massive power plays happening behind the scenes. Like, think about it, those golden rays of sunrise, they've got no idea the world might be on the brink of chaos.
Right, and that's exactly what we're diving into today, how global tensions can go from, like, simmering to a full-on boil.
And the sources you sent, they really paint a picture. It starts subtly, right? News reports here and there, skirmishes in places that feel a million miles away.
Eastern Europe, South China Sea, those kinds of places.
Exactly. Those become the early warning signs, like the pressure points in a system that's about to burst.
It's like watching a pot on the stove. Little bubbles start to rise, you feel the heat building, but you can't be sure when it'll boil over.
And that's the thing about escalation. It often starts with these isolated incidents. But then they start feeding into each other. And that's when you see things like alliances like NATO getting involved, emergency sessions, closed-door meetings. You know, the drill.
And those meetings, they're not just for show, are they? That's when it starts to feel real.
Oh, absolutely. You start seeing sanctions, ultimatums being issued, and it's like, okay, diplomacy's failing, we're moving into a whole new territory, and these actions, they have very real consequences. Economies are impacted, options are limited, and suddenly, even a tiny miscalculation could have huge ripple effects.
So we've got this powder keg of global tension just waiting to blow.
Hmm.
What actually lights the fuse? What pushes things over the edge?
Well, the source calls it a flashpoint, that single event, the one that shatters the illusion of peace. It could be a missile launch, maybe a huge cyber attack that cripples a nation's infrastructure. Or even, and this might sound strange, something as seemingly minor as a naval clash that just spirals out of control.
And in that moment, everything changes.
Yeah.
1 minute you're trying to negotiate, the next you're what, scrambling fighter jets?
It's a tough thing to wrap your head around, that shift. Going from diplomacy to military action.
Yeah, it's a big jump.
It's about demonstrating what's called escalation dominance. Basically, it's a way for a nation to project strength, to show they're not afraid to use force, and hopefully deter further aggression.
But wouldn't that also increase the stakes? I mean, isn't there a huge risk things could escalate even further?
Absolutely. And to make matters worse, imagine trying to get accurate information during a crisis like that. The source mentions satellites going dark.
Which is pretty ominous when you think about
It's
it.
a chilling thought, right? Because in a modern conflict, information itself becomes a weapon. And when communication is disrupted, well, the potential for miscalculation, for acting on false information, it just skyrockets, creates this climate of fear and uncertainty, not just for world leaders, but for everyday people trying to understand what's going on.
And it's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical side of things, the strategies and the alliances. But the source doesn't let us forget about the human cost.
Right, when you see those images, empty grocery store shelves, people lined up for gas,
Air raid sirens, those are chilling too.
those aren't just isolated incidents. That's a whole system teetering on the brink, supply chains disrupted, people getting desperate, and the air raid sirens. I mean, it's a terrifying thought that even in this day and age, that threat is still very real.
It makes you think one day things seem normal, and then suddenly the world's a different place. The source talks about families huddled around TVs, warplanes flying overhead. Living like that, with that kind of fear hanging over you, it must do something to you.
It's primal, isn't it? That survival instinct kicks in, and it can be good and bad at the same time. You're on high alert, every decision is about survival. It's no wonder people want to flee the cities, head for the countryside.
Like that instinct to build a bunker, to stockpile supplies.
Exactly. It's not always rational, but it's understandable.
It makes you wonder, though, what would you do? Would you stay put? Or would you try to escape? Tough choices.
No easy answers there. The source really gets into the psychology of it all, how living under that kind of pressure can really mess with your head, how fear can drive you to make decisions you might not otherwise.
Yeah, the source points out this weird contradiction. Like, prepping for the worst, it's both rational and, at the same time, a sign of how deeply this stuff affects you.
Yeah. We're resilient humans. We can adapt to almost anything, but we're also vulnerable to fear, to panic. And when you start talking about the possibility of things escalating beyond conventional warfare, well, that's when things get really unsettling.
Because, let's face it, nuclear conflict, that's a whole other level of terrifying.
Yeah.
The source used this phrase that really stuck with me. Nations with nuclear capabilities sit on a knife's edge.
It's a powerful image, isn't it? And it reminds us how fragile things really are. This isn't just about nations going to war, it's about the potential for, well, global catastrophe.
It's almost too big to really comprehend.
You're not wrong. We're not talking about just another weapon here. We're talking about something that can wipe out entire cities, something with long-term consequences we can't even fully grasp.
Right, it's heavy stuff.
Yeah,
But I think it's important to talk about it even if it's uncomfortable.
I agree. The source doesn't sugarcoat it, and neither should we. There's a very real danger of escalation, of one wrong move leading to something truly unthinkable. And when you're dealing with that kind of power, well, the consequences are almost impossible to imagine.
So how do we even start to get our heads around that? I mean, if these weapons are so destructive, why do they even exist?
That's the billion-dollar question. The source talks about mutually assured destruction. MAD, for short.
Mad.
Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't exactly inspire confidence.
No, it doesn't. The basic idea is that the very existence of these weapons prevents their use. Like, the logic is, no country would risk a nuclear attack if it meant their own destruction.
So it's a deterrent.
Right. A terrifying one, and incredibly risky, but a deterrent nonetheless. The idea is that the fear of total annihilation is what keeps the peace. Whether that's a stable foundation for global security, well, that's a whole other discussion.
It does make you wonder, though, what happens if that deterrent fails?
That's a question that keeps a lot of people up at night. And it brings us back to diplomacy, to communication, to finding ways to de-escalate these situations before they reach a point of no return.
It's a lot to take in, that's for sure. I mean, the potential consequences of nuclear war are just, well, it's hard to even imagine. But the source also talks about how people cope, how they find ways to adapt and survive, even with that kind of threat hanging over them.
It's remarkable, isn't it? The resilience of the human spirit. Even when faced with these huge existential threats, people find a way. The source mentions people building underground shelters, learning how to grow food in the most unlikely places, finding ways to live with less.
Yeah, it's like you can see those things as signs of despair, but there's also this element of hope,
Yeah.
Like we're not giving up.
Exactly. Throughout history, it's that ingenuity, that ability to adapt, that's allowed us to overcome some pretty incredible challenges. Those shelters, they become more than just a place to hide. They represent hope, a belief that even in the darkest times, there's a future worth fighting for.
So where does that leave us? We started with this feeling, this tension of a seemingly ordinary day, and then, well, we went down the rabbit hole. Global conflict, nuclear weapons. It's a lot to process.
It is, but it's important that we do process it. These are conversations we can't shy away from. The source you shared, it's not about scaring people, it's about making us aware of what's at stake and how important it is to stay informed, to stay engaged.
Because ultimately, the more we know, the better off we are, right? The better equipped we are to make sense of it all, to make informed decisions, to maybe even find a way to create a safer, more peaceful world.
Exactly. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of something as huge and complex as global conflict. But we all have a role to play in shaping the future. It starts with staying informed, having these tough conversations, and supporting those who are working towards peace.
There's always that glimmer of hope, that belief that we can make things better. It's important to hold on to that, even with all the uncertainty.
I couldn't agree more. We can't ignore the dangers, that's for sure. But we can't give in to fear and despair either. There's always hope, and there's always the potential for human courage and ingenuity to light the way forward.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those big questions, to think about what role you want to play in creating a more peaceful future. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep seeking knowledge, and keep diving deep.